You ready?
Yes.
Yenden quingi shikyo drinchen je
Sujin demba lamgi zawa ru leba duma yi guba jemba demba jingilo linjin nimi dewa densandi shindu nige dinjin shigyo name ninsen gundu nimbo lembelo gyunje meba gewa jingilo Lusa yuwa shui shuburshin Yudu jibe shiwa drenpadam Shiwe jesu ludan drimashin Kanda lengkwe jishin dhamala Hemba tempo nyele nyebeso Chashin chawa nangyam pawadam Keso tada drupa shebala Tadu padan tempa jingilo Chebe minon dungen kunge go yide miron sibe punzoki Nime rine tarbe dewala Tune chemba gewa jingilo Nda samba deyi jamba yi Jendan shishin bayu shimbo yi Tembe sawa soso tarbala Nyimbo jeba jingilo rani siso lungwa jishin tuwa magyo dowa kinyan dendawa Tomne drowa drowe kugyawe Chanshu sencho chungpa jingilo Senzan kekyan tutum namzum la Gomba mena chanchu midrupa Lebar dini gyase tombala Zuba drapo lobar jingilo Lobe yula yanwa jije shin Yanda dala zishin jibayi Shine lakton sumdu jawe lama Nyuru gyula gewar jingilo Tumo lamja nudu gyubana Deba kungi shogyo darjete Kesan kewo jono damba de la nidu jubar jingilo Tetse nanjo nami drubeshi nanda danse tomba sungwala Chama mebe neba jingirne sodan de sungwar jingilo Gini kia dena jishin tone sambayi Tunje neja chile miya wan Dambe sushin drubar jingilo Lansan tumbe shinyen dan sushin drube jona shabden Chinan nangi barde jube zom Yiwar shiwar jingilak tu zom Nawa kundu yanda lama dan Drami chiki bella lanjujin Sara langi yanden rabzone Dorje changi kokan yurdo cho Sangye chudan sogi chunan la Janjo bardu dani gyasuji Dagi chanyen gibe sonam gi Jola benju sangye drubar sho Sangye chudan sogi chunam la Janjo bardu dani gyasuji Dagi chanyen gibe sonam gi Jola benju sangye drubar sho Sangye chunan soge chunam la Janjo bardu dani gyabsuji Dagi chunyen gibe sunam gi Rola benju sangye drubar shu Saji bugi juji medan dram Lirab linjin ninde gyambadi Sangye shingdu mikde uaragi Drogun namda shinla jabaru Dhamma guru ratna mandala kam yatayami. Okay. So last time I kind of digressed a little bit and talked about patience at the end of the class. I don't know if that ended up confusing people or not. And ended up talking about the last kind of patients, which I think caught people's interest. But the type of patients that I was reminded of at that point was really a different form. And so I brought the book with me today to kind of address that more specifically. So the idea was that what's interesting about this chapter is it's not really kind of what should I say, conceptually focused on Abhidharma type explanations. It's more general, it's broader, but it's definitely meant to cover the entire subject of suffering. I mean, as I hope you remember, these first four chapters, which is what we're planning to cover, are meant to be antidotes for the four so-called inverted, literally, views, which mistakenly think of things in a way that is the opposite of the way the Buddha taught them in the Four Noble Truths. So permanence rather than impermanence, in this case, happiness or well-being rather than suffering, and so on. So it's more general. The discussion is in the verses, specific verses, are really, I guess, probably more focused on the idea of presenting the notion that any idea about our being that is satisfactory or something that we can think of as acceptable on its own is to be kind of uprooted and replaced by the idea that nothing about samsara is satisfactory. So, I mean, if you take it from the point of view of the Abhidharma, what they would say is, first of all, they would say that our being consists of the five skandhas, and more specifically, the form of the five skandhas that represents our samsaric nature is the skandhas that are referred to as sahasrava in Sanskrit. Sahasrava means associated with or related to asravas, which is a somewhat obscure term that means something synonymous to the mental afflictions. Asrava literally means something which flows out, in this case, the mental affliction. So our five impure heaps or our five contaminated heaps is typically the way the term is rendered in English. So that any form of that mode of existence is something that is in no way to be considered satisfactory. So the idea is relating to that is that if we don't see it as unsatisfactory, then we won't develop this idea of kind of concern is a kind of a generic way of putting it, but the Sanskrit term udvega means to be alarmed or to be upset even about the unsatisfactory nature of existence. So if we don't think it's unsatisfactory, we're not going to have that sense of disquiet about our existence. And that sense of disquiet is really important because it's what motivates you to want to do something about your unsatisfactoriness. Unless you are concerned about it, you won't feel any need to do anything to correct whatever is wrong about our lives. So, I mean, that's really what the whole idea of unsatisfactoriness is meant to evoke. Anyway, and the way Aya Davis sort of introduced the chapter is by saying that he used the simile that the body, so the focus of suffering is on the body, the physical aspect of our being is the most prominent element which manifests that unsatisfactoriness. And so in that sense, then he uses the simile of being an enemy, like an enemy. We should regard our body as being like an enemy, meaning something that is harmful to us by causing our suffering. And yet the first verse says, despite that, we need to preserve our body. We need to take care of it. We need to, because it's useful and because it is the vessel that allows us to apply ourselves to some spiritual purpose. And then turns around in the very next verse, he tempers that by saying, doesn't say it directly, but it's sort of contrasting with the idea of preserving it. He says we should not, and the word in Tibetan is guba. Guba usually means respect, but it means not to be overly attentive to our physical well-being, and being, in that sense, kind of engaging in behavior where we're looking for ways in which to indulge ourselves and mistakenly pursue some kind of experiences that we might think of as being pleasurable or satisfactory. Then that is kind of the very essence of what is meant to be stopped. So then we were up to verse 7. At any rate, towards the end of the last class, the idea was that so it used the same, verse 6 again says, being attentive to the body is the same thing as if you were being attentive to an enemy. Again, he uses that simile of enemy. So the idea is that the enemy is somebody who is meant to do you harm, and therefore you don't sort of, bow to the enemy. You don't sort of, give in to the enemy, because the enemy doesn't mean you well. And so by the same token, we should not think of our bodies as something that we should pamper, even if you want to use that term. And so it uses the phrase that the body is like a vessel for suffering. And so what that reminded me of was this idea of this particular type of patience. So if we're focusing on, and we're kind of addressing the idea that everything about our samsaric existence is not okay, so to speak, then how do we deal with that unsatisfactoriness? And so one of the things was that there is a particular kind of patience that is meant to sort of endure whatever hardships we are confronted with in our lives, because we are pursuing some larger purpose. And whatever hardships we encounter, we should not allow them to deter us, not allow them to discourage us, so to speak. So anyway, just to run through what Asanga says in the Bodhisattva Bhumi. So there's a passage which describes this as the patience that I translated as the patience that tolerates suffering. And so that's not talking about, in acts or encounters in which someone's trying to do you harm and cause you suffering in that way. It just means your everyday life, whatever discomfort, whatever, you know, tribulation, if you like, you have to put up with. In fact, we should put up with it. So if I just read this passage and then we can go from this. So he starts out with it's just a generic description of what patience is. And then he says, what is a bodhisattva's patience that tolerates suffering? So this is a particular type of practice of sort of enduring whatever difficulties you face in your trying to pursue some kind of spiritual life. So here, and he casts it in terms of Mahayana practice. So he says, here a bodhisattva rightly learns the following. Formerly, as a person who engaged in the enjoyment of sense pleasures and who pursued those pleasures. Okay, so that's relevant to the topic at hand, which is to say that the ordinary samsaric person mistakenly is drawn to, pursuing activities of sensory pleasures on their own, thinking that they are worthwhile. And so here he says that in the course of pursuing those pleasures, meaning before you were aware that you should turn your back on them, then he says, I accepted, tolerated, and experienced a multitude of intense forms of suffering as I engaged in such occupations as farming, commerce, service to the king, for the sake of sense pleasures whose true nature consists of suffering. So that's a kind of a way of introducing a subject where he's saying that life is such that even living it as an ordinary person, where you have to provide for your material needs, and those material needs include giving you some kind of sensory comfort, then there is some kind of effort, there's some kind of difficulty. So in the case of agriculture, for instance, obviously that's physically taxing. So any kind of ordinary livelihood that you pursue has its challenges to it, and nevertheless you accept those challenges because they are the way in which you gain your livelihood. And so you think of them as sort of the price of pursuing what you need to sustain yourself. And so that's a kind of discomfort that in the past you thought of as acceptable and something which is what you had to do. So now he's saying here, he says that you know that those sensory pleasures actually are rather than in any way inherently satisfactory, they actually are a form of samsaric existence, samsaric suffering. So he says, my willing acceptance of that meaningless great suffering for the sake of what actually consists of nothing but suffering. So suffering that you tolerated in order to just continue in your samsaric existence. He says, so kind of that is, from the Dharma point of view, if that's your only purpose in life, that's meaningless, he says. He says, given that you were willing to do that in that context, he says, however, so that was done due to the fault of a lack of understanding. So it's saying, previously that was the way you lived your life because you didn't know better. He says, now, with the recognition that I'm pursuing a virtuous activity, it's a dharma, that will bring about happiness, meaning then liberation and supreme enlightenment. So therefore, that is something that's worth pursuing. And whatever hardship you may encounter in pursuing such a worthwhile goal, it is proper for me to willingly tolerate that suffering, even if it's 1 trillion times greater than the former suffering that I willingly accepted. He says, let alone should I be willing to accept any, relatively minor kind of suffering, some smaller form of suffering. So that's kind of the basic formulation of what this kind of suffering is. So it's kind of like girding yourself to be willing to, accept whatever it takes in order to successfully pursue some kind of Dharma activity. And it's given that that may in fact involve some minor forms of hardship along the way, that you should basically think of them as, insignificant and something that you gladly tolerate. So that's the kind of patience that I was getting at. And so, that's something that really is a companion to the idea of understanding the nature of samsaric existence. Is we have to give, even if we recognize it as being, fundamentally unsatisfactory, we should be able and willing to endure and, kind of carry on. So there are a lot of things that are at play in saying that. First of all, it's saying that you have an awareness of your existence as being unsatisfactory. And for a lot of us, that may not be all that clear. It may not be very much part of our conscious, understanding that we approach our daily life as being something that is fundamentally unsatisfactory from the point of view of Dharma. And by unsatisfactory does not necessarily mean overtly painful, but just, at a deeper level, unsatisfactory, as expressed in the doctrine, say, of, the suffering of conditioned existence. So that was really the point that I was trying to make at the end of the class last time. Now he goes on to describe, he says suffering, he says, describes what is the kind of hardship that you have to endure. And then he formulates, the Sasanga formulates kind of 8 categories of your daily life where, you have to deal with challenges and which may be to a smaller or greater degree, unpleasant or difficult. And then he goes through and he describes them. Now, what's interesting here is that he talks about it largely in terms of from the perspective of a renunciate, from someone who is, has abandoned an ordinary householder's life. But at the end, he does even, in fact, say that, this kind of practice, this kind of patience can be also cultivated by a householder. And, so if you're a householder, it likely means that you are engaged in some kind of livelihood that is not directly connected with the Dharma, but which you are necessarily following. And so you should be willing to endure whatever challenges that livelihood poses to you, well, with understanding in the back of your mind that, it's a necessary thing, and that then with whatever free time you have, you then would be looking forward to applying yourself to the Dharma. So that's kind of, I think one of the reasons why I brought it up is that it really, I think, captures to some degree kind of the, a very fundamental sort of way of understanding your daily life. It's not the idea of thinking about everything as being suffering is one thing, but then there are other elements of how what kind of attitudes we should have as we go through our daily existence. And so this patience, this particular kind of patience, is one that I think is relevant. And thinking about it, even just thinking about it, I think sort of helps to reinforce the idea of what's kind of unique to a person who's trying to pursue a Dharma way of life, and that this is an element of what properly should be in the back of your mind. It should be part of your kind of overall understanding of what life involves. So that was sort of my reason for bringing it up. Yeah.
What picture the stuff
where this patience is okay. So the introduction of it is on page 319. And then he, as I said, after describing it, he then identifies 8 different areas where this kind of hardship may be, manifesting itself for us, and then how to think in each of those situations.
What section number is it?
Oh, you mean like the coding of it?
Yeah.
So 1 for book 1.
Yes.
11, I guess, for chapter 11. 2.2 for the sections.
111, 2.2.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So anyway, I kind of get the feeling that the third kind of patient was something that sort of caught people's attention more because it was somewhat more, based on knowledge rather than just sort of quality of patience that involves kind of putting up with things that are unpleasant. Anyway, okay, so with that, then we can go back to the text itself. So we're up to verse 7, and in Gyetsabje's outline for it, this is the third section of a series of verses which he describes as how to meditate on the nature of suffering, kind of in a somewhat extensive way. He says extensive way. And so the heading for this third topic is that reflecting on how the body does not diverge from a suffering nature. I mean, it has a suffering nature, and that suffering nature cannot be altered even. So sort of like recognizing that the nature of the body is suffering, and not thinking that there's anything that we can do to change that. That's kind of the way it is. The verses explained. Then let's see, what do we have here in Chandrakirti? I like the Chandrakirti's kind of lead-ins to the verses. I think they also give some kind of insight into how he views the essence of the verse that he's going to address. He says, the body cannot be made to take on a satisfactory nature. For that reason, then it says, one needs to realize that its nature is the opposite of that, is the opposite of anything, of any form of any kind of satisfactory form of existence. So, okay, so I think this is an interesting verse. I mean, I don't want to. I was struck by a kind of the way this verse is explained by Chandrakirti. I thought it was interesting, and I thought it sort of instructive in a particular way. But anyway, let's read it. So it says, "Luni shintu goroe kyang deoe datu migurte." Right. The first half of the verse says, "Shintu goroe" means even after a long time. Right. Goroa means goroa means to take a long time. In ordinary Tibetan or colloquial Tibetan, gorgidu means is suggesting that something is taking longer even perhaps than you thought, or something like that, which is not the particular meaning here, but I'm just saying how the Tibetan is usually understood. The Sanskrit which exists for this verse is simply that even after a long time. So you can try to transform your body into some sort of, pleasant nature, but no matter how much time you take to do that, then it will not arise. It will not take on a nature of that is satisfactory. You can't sort of transform the body from an unsatisfactory state into a satisfactory state. He says, and then the second half of the verse is it's a play on self, right? Because so essence, the word for essence is swabhava, right? Swabhava means its own mode of being, and swa is the reflexive pronoun oneself, and then here it uses para, which is other. So what it's saying is that, there was mentioned in one of the other verses that the only way that we can experience anything that we think of as being satisfactory is things from the outside. So we sort of try to pursue experiences that will somehow, bestow on us some kind of pleasant, quality. And that comes from the outside. It's not the way the body is constructed. So here it says, then Ranxin. The first one, Ranxin, is nature, right? So that nature is the nature of being pleasant. Then it says, Shengi sil numba. Shengi means something other than the body, something separate from the body. So it's saying no matter what you do to take things that are not part of the body and try to sort of, introduce them to the body as a way of sort of causing the body to sort of change from its kind of natural unsatisfactory state into a satisfactory state, he says it cannot be done. You cannot, no matter how much you do to try to introduce from the outside happiness into your body, it will not cause your body to change from its unsatisfactory nature into one that is, something that represents happiness, so to speak. And to me, that's a really nice image, because I think it captures what we try to do in our lives. Is we look for experiences, we look for opportunities that will enable us to bring what we think of as some kind of well-being. And so what he's saying here is that that's a misguided concept, that it's not going to work. So it says, so no matter how much you try to bombard your body, that's my word, not in the verse, it will not in any way change the body's characteristic of being a vessel for suffering. Okay. So we read briefly the commentary, which basically is just kind of parsing the words in such a way to clarify that point. So he says, Yun Ringbor means for a long time, right? Dewe Gyur Gyurbe Longche Ki means experiences, right? Longche means then enjoyments, right? Enjoyments, which represent a cause of temporary happiness, you might say, right? Or what is misperceived to be some form of happiness. Then then here you use the word gyangba. Gyangba means if we, gyangba is a word which means to take care of, in this case, to look after the body by sort of introducing pleasant experiences to it. Then Shintu Gorwe Kyang means even after a long time, Dewe Tatu Magyurte, right? Your body's not going to change from its fundamental state of being, again, one of the 5 impure skandhas, particularly the first one, right? And for that reason, then as we discussed, for instance, in I think one of the earlier classes, that there's a kind of natural indisposition which the body has by virtue of the fact that We carry all of the imprints of our past misdeeds, and those imprints are something which sort of are a drag on our bodies, and to that extent on the mind that is inhabiting the body, and so therefore we are not able to by introducing pleasurable experiences do anything to lessen that natural indisposition that the body has. Okay. The reason why you can't change the body is because the body has a suffering nature, right? The body's nature is that it has a form of unsatisfactoriness that is kind of inherent in it. So, I mean, at the very least, that implies that the inclination to seek ordinary pleasures is misguided, right? And that you should therefore leave off to some extent doing that, and recognize that your body, in fact, is the basis of a lot of unsatisfactoriness, and accept that and recognize that, and start from that understanding to look for some more transcendent way of alleviating whatever that unsatisfactoriness consists of. So the key to the last part of the verse is that interesting term, which is overwhelmed by something else, right? You can't overwhelm the body you can't bombard the body with pleasurable experiences and expect that somehow then the body's going to somehow change into something that remains in a state of ease. That's an interesting, thing to reflect and to contemplate. That's the implication is that ordinary behavior, the behavior of ordinary persons, seems to suggest, whether they actually think of it that way or not, but it seems to suggest that that might be a possibility. And so this is saying foolish to do that. Okay, and then that's basically the verse. And we have this simile, which is part of the tradition, part of the history of this text. As we said in the beginning, I believe it was Dharma Dasa, I think it was some unidentified early teacher who perhaps wrote a commentary on Aryadeva's text, and Chandrakirti must have been aware of them and makes reference to them in his text. And so he uses it here. This happens to be available in the original, but it says Kujogi Chugushino. He says, like the young of the cuckoo bird. Right? Is that what it is? Kuju is the cuckoo, I think. So it says that says Charogi Jizam Genkan. So the idea is that somehow a young cuckoo chick finds its way into the nest, or comes under the care of crows, right? So a cuckoo bird doesn't look anything like a crow, and yet the crows take the cuckoo bird and raise it, and it says that no matter how much the crows do to take care of the cuckoo bird is going to stay a cuckoo bird. It's not going to turn into a crow. So that's the kind of the simile for this, right? Charo gi mimbam. It's just no matter how well the crows take care of the chick, it will not become a crow,
will not turn into a crow. Charogi mimba means it is not a crow. Therefore, lu dewe ranshin du dewa yang dedan zhao. So he says, wanting, and this is a nice phrase because it kind of captures the idea, wanting our bodies to take on a satisfactory nature is like that. So the things that we do to introduce well-being to our physical aspect, especially, is, what should I say, an impossible thing, and yet I think it's fair to say the verse is suggesting that's what ordinary people seem to be trying to do, and so that there's a certain amount of irony in the Dharma. I'm reminded of a famous verse. I don't remember the exact wording of it, but something like, I think there's different versions of it. It's in the Lamrim, and it says that, I forget, Shariputra maybe. If you look in the Lamrim, it mentions it. And so he comes to this house, Shariputra, or one of the Arhats, and he looks at the house and people that are in the house. There's a father, an older husband and wife, and a baby, and a dog, and a fish. You know the story? Remember the story? Yeah.
Vaguely,
So it's saying that the previous, patriarch, the father of the now head of the household, had died and was reborn in a pond behind the house. And they had caught the fish as a fish in the pond. They caught the fish and they were eating it. And so then something about, I think a dog had previously been someone that, I don't remember exactly, something maybe had involved in adultery with the wife or something like that, and they were feeding the fish. So he came here, and he the idea was that the Arhat saw this scene where these people who were previously their lives had been completely different, and now they were interacting in a way that just seemed so absurd, and he just burst into laughter. So that kind of irony is something that you do encounter in the Dharma. Typically, when you're addressing the futility of the ordinary samsaric existence, which I find I don't know, maybe I'm anyway, it's an interesting kind of sentiment about how Dharma person. Not to say that you don't need to read into it that the Dharma person is sort of necessarily thinking in a disparaging way, but just sort of recognizing some kind of irony. Okay, I was just reminded of that. Okay, so then we go now to the next one, right? So number 4, the next verse, verse A, says, so how is it? It's to reflect on the manner in which suffering harms us, can harm us. So there are different ways in which suffering can harm us. So what's interesting is how the way Chandrakirti analyzes the verses is that he takes them and there's a certain progression to them. So whatever is said in a particular verse, there's kind of like a dialogue between. I like to think of it as a dialogue between an ordinary person who does not understand Dharma well, and so the verse is sort of giving some instruction of a particular kind to the person, and then the idea is that you understand the verse, and then the person, acknowledges the truthfulness of that verse, and then the next verse shifts to, well, then what about this? Right? What about this? How about this? As a, kind of, it's just kind of like you cannot
fully give up your attachment to samsaric pleasures or some idea that maybe there is something in samsara which is worth pursuing. So the next verse says about that, he says, Dinyamdu, Dungali Yed Sinkang, Matsarwani, Dama Ibene, Mayinte. So he says, Dita. He says, yeah, he says, there is suffering. Okay, so it's true that one can encounter suffering. He says, but he says, it's also true that some people who are fortunate, right, might never have to experience that suffering. And by avoiding any kind of suffering, then is that not a way to find a satisfactory way of life? So he says, Kachi ni keva ne tamte chiwa la tuku bardu chiktu dewa dan dembar nawa. Right? Does he say something? Usually, Geshe gives something somewhat similar to that. So here he says, Gerila sopakin. So saying, there are certain individuals. This is from Chandakirti, and you can read it into the kind of a condensed form of it. He says, some persons from the time of their death, from the time of their birth, rather, it's just from their very birth, are born into the lap of luxury, right? And then until they die, they don't experience anything but pleasure. So they're saying, so a royal family, they have authority, they have wealth, and so they can, lavish well-being on their children and on themselves, for that matter. And so, therefore, kind of like where you're born, what your station in life is, right? So there's the poor guys at the bottom of the heap. Yeah, they have miserable, they have to fend for themselves, and they, are exposed to suffering. But what about those unique few that are kind of at the top of the heap? Do they not have the opportunity to experience nothing but ease because they are never forced to endure anything unpleasant? So this is kind of addressing that. Semjen chakti gyuba shi chenbo la rawa shapan namkyang de la yengve toram gyurso. So in other words, if you have everything that you could ever want, and you can always sort of indulge your whims, then you never have to experience suffering. So is that not a form of satisfactory life? And he said, so it says, so for such a person, how can you say that that person's physical existence has the nature of suffering? In other words, they don't experience suffering. He says, so then this next verse is meant to be a response to that. And this is kind of interesting. It reminded me of another verse in one of Nagarjuna's texts, which I think is in my notes. In which he says that there are only two kinds of well-being. One, the mental well-being and physical well-being. And he says the mental well-being is conceptually, dependent, and physical well-being is using the unique idea about pleasure, which is to say that all pleasures are nothing but remediation of a greater pain, and that we perceive that as something pleasurable, which hopefully we'll get to after we run through the verses. At any rate, here he uses that same distinction between kind of those who are at a higher station of life, and those that are at a lower station of life. So he's saying, those, here in this verse, he's using that same distinction. So now Arjuna says that, similarly, he says that those who are at a higher station of life, they may not have to endure physical suffering, but they also have mental pain. So he says,
chokla yiki dungete tamana la luke so dunge niki jitendi nirenin jomberche.
okay, so he says that basically this verse is saying that no matter what your station in life is, you cannot escape suffering. So he says, chogla means those who are, the foremost, or those who are prominent persons. The suffering that they mostly experience is mental in nature. And then tama means those who are lowly, those who are kind of working class, if you like. And those persons mostly have to endure pain that arises through the body. So there's not only physical pain, there's also mental pain. And then it says, second half of the verse says, by means of these two types of suffering, this world meaning all persons in this world, day by day, ahani ahani. This is interesting, right? There's the Sanskrit is ahani ahani hanyate. Sounds very nice, right? Ahani ahani means every day. Hanyate means they are destroyed, or they are hurt by these two kinds of suffering. So, Rangi Punzu. So the one is saying that those persons who are, enjoying great wealth and great authority, they are. It doesn't really say so much here. Well, let's read what Getzavir says, and then we can look at Chandrakirti. He's a little more specific. So it says, Quarter means a retinue, right? The idea, this is an idea in Buddhism or in Indian culture, that persons who are of some standing and persons who are some authority, they have a large following. This idea of a retinue, right? So the king has a retinue. In the Dharma, then that notion of a retinue also is relevant, because it enables a Dharma practitioner, especially someone who's trying to teach, that if they have a large following, then that enables them to have a wider influence. So one is that a retinue, and then wealth. Those who have a large retinue and large wealth, such as those who are in the royal family, Gyawala Sokwa Chok means then that's what is meant by then the foremost. So don't forget, this is something being written probably in the 2nd century of India. Then it says those kind of persons, and this is what Getsav just says, that they are actually Chandrakirti says it, they are subject to envy. It's interesting because using the word envy, usually the word envy is defined as among the secondary mental afflictions as a form of hatred. It's actually a form of hatred, which is evoked when you perceive someone else, a rival, as having something that you don't have, and then you can't tolerate it, and you get upset by it. That's usually the way it's described. Then it's using the same term, but the way it's described by Chandrakirti is a little bit different from that.
Here, Gesab just says, Rangi punsok. Rangi punsok means
One's, punsok means excellence, literally, right? So it means one's resources, even, right? Or whatever it is that are the elements of your life that are, give it, great ease, right? If you have a lot of servants, or if you have a lot of people that do your bidding, that kind of thing. Then here it says there is a concern that would be diminished, that would be lost. Nyam dogni, right? That's the way Geshe describes it. And then also, then here, the second one, he uses the more typical way of describing envy. Shengi punsok, right? Somebody else's excellence, right? Someone else's success, right? La miserva means that you measure yourself by, is there anybody else who has more than you do? If there is, then you try to outdo them or something like that. Or you can't, it's upsetting to think that there are other people who, are better off than you are, and in comparison to whom you don't measure up. That's a form of mental, agitation. Miserve. Then here it says that's the yigitunga. That is mental suffering. And there are many other. There are other kinds of. There are other ways that are talking about sakpe dungel, right? Sakpe dungel, soe dungel, right? So in our pursuit of our the resources to live by, right? So then we have to strive to accumulate some kind of wealth, right, in order to sustain ourselves. So that's called sakpe dungel, right? That's the suffering of trying to accumulate wealth that you don't already have, right? So that's one form of suffering in relation to material things. Then a soe dungel means if you are able to amass some considerable wealth, then it becomes the worry of not having it be lost, right? How to preserve it, right? Or if someone might try to steal it from you, right, by deceit or whatever. So then that becomes a mental type of suffering. Those are different ways of describing the difficulties that we encounter in relation to material things. So here it says nyam dokpa, same thing. Nyam dokpa means worrying that it might be diminished is kind of another way of saying the suffering of trying to preserve it, at least. Yigidungel dang, gyundudente. Gyundudente means they are just something that they are constantly having to deal with, right? Gyundudemba. Gyundudemba means they possess it or they're subject to it. Then second kind is physical, right? Yojeki pongba tama means then the persons, the lowly persons, right? Those are then yojeki pongba means then they are destitute, right? Yojeki pongba means pongba means without, to be lacking in possessions, and that is a hardship, right? So for many people, for a majority of people, then that is the condition that we deal with, right? It's trying to live, what is it, paycheck to paycheck. Tamala namla. So for them, torwa dungel lulikias. So in order to accumulate wealth, then they have to endure whatever physical hardships are required in order to obtain minimal kind of resources. So there are those two kinds, mental and physical. Right? Then it's just the same. In that way, by means of these two kinds of suffering, the world, this world,
Nire nire shindu means day by day, day by day. Jomba jedo is Jomba means destroyed, but it doesn't necessarily mean destroyed. It means they are oppressed or harmed. Okay, so let me read because this is a nice kind of wording that Chandrakirti uses to describe the former of those people who are well off and what kind of mental and torment they are subject to. So it just says here. It says, "Loncho chasing rikang demba la doba lam chawa deda la ni ngumbar dobe shi chembo la toberkao." So it just says then they no matter so it's got the idea that no matter how much wealth you have, it's never enough, right? If you're really wealthy, you're always looking for the next deal that will bring you some even greater wealth. And so that kind of life, you are faced with the stress and the difficulty of being able to succeed in the next venture that will add further to your riches. So that's the one kind of mental dissatisfaction. Then here it says so it says because they are subject to, and here he uses the word for envy, right? I'm reading from is that Chandrakirti?
Yes.
Okay, so he says Chakdo Pelchoa. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Chakdo Pelchoa means they are subject to this word, which usually means envy, but we have to think of it a little bit more broadly than the typical way of thinking of envy. So it says they are subject to extensive or subject to envy to a great degree. Pelchoa means that's something that is kind of one of their sins, if you like. That they always have this kind of worry, this kind of mental agitation. So it says, "Döva minyaba le keva yi döva minyaba le keva yingim." So it says döva minyaba means döva minyaba le keva yigitungel dopa meba. Let me see what this we have in the sound. In Tibetan it says "döva minyaba," right? It says they fail to obtain what they desire. Actually, I think it's words a little bit differently. He says, so he says, this is interesting because "döva minyaba" means failing to obtain. That's labha in Sanskrit, right? Labha. Ishta, alava means then the failure to obtain what is desired, right? But actually, the Sanskrit says another reading. This is in the Sanskrit. It says ishta means desire, and lobha. Lobha is not lava. Lobha means avarice. Avarice. So it's like greed and avarice, right? So that envy which they have, right, because of not being able to tolerate another person's, success, causes what it does is it evokes or it triggers their own avarice and their own greed in order to try to outdo somebody else. He says that's interesting because that seems to be maybe the translation was from a different manuscript, but Ishtaloba Jammanasam means that having greed and avarice, the mental pain which comes from greed and avarice. I think that reads better than failure to obtain your desire, right? So this is because they have envy,
Right.
right? That envy, in fact, is what stokes their greed and avarice, and so therefore they have mental suffering. So that's an interesting way of kind of tying together the use of the word envy in this context.
Can I just clarify?
Sure.
Lobha was avarice and labha is greed?
No, labha is obtained. So say
Oh.
there's two words. Ishta means the thing desired,
Okay.
and then labha means to obtain. So it looks like there was one reading was failing to obtain what is desired. That's the way the Tibetan translation is. And I'm saying that at least the way the manuscript was deciphered here, it says ishta loba, and loba is kind of avarice. So it's kind of a different kind of compound. I don't know what the word for it is, but it's greed and avarice rather than failure to obtain what is desired.
Right.
They're different reading. I like that one. I don't know. I'm not saying 100% that's the way it is, but it's one way to read it. Okay, so then, so this is saying that even those who don't have any physical, hardship in their lives do not escape suffering, right? Seems to be the main message there, right? Okay. And then, do you want to read the similes? This is kind of a, yes? So, all right, so let's read the Tibetan, and I guess we can't avoid completely dealing with them. I don't know how much they really add to it, but they're meant, I think, really they are, it is a part of I think, the Indian aesthetic, which is to introduce things that have some sort of literary appeal to them that kind of enhances the original verse. So that's what these similes are. It's kind of like the tradition of Subhashita, which is to write these really elaborate, poems that have some kind of, message in them, and just reading them is sort of pleasurable. I think that's kind of what the idea is with these similes, is they just sort of add a little sort of tidbit that kind of the commentator sort of uses it to reinforce the message. So this one is about an elephant keeper. Okay, so this is the head elephant keeper, and how that head elephant keeper reacts to two individuals, one of whom successfully is able to tame a wild elephant, and one of whom fails. And so he reacts to. So the one who successfully tames him, right, provokes mental suffering, in the head guy. And then the other guy who fails gets punished, and so he's the low guy who has to endure
The physical.
pain. So it says, for example, a king, langwache means elephant, right? Langwache la gyembe mi. Langwache la gyemba means gyemba means he mounted the elephant. Right? In other words, in order to tame the elephant, this unruly elephant, he has to get up onto it and sort of bring it under control, kind of like the Indian version of bronco busting, right? Gyembe mi dulce keba. Dulce keba means dulwe jeba means the behavior of taming, skillful, right? So that person, he's the first one, right? So the king sort of orders this person to get up on that elephant and tame him. So this first person is good at it. He gets up on it. He does successfully tame the elephant, and that pleases the king. Right? Gawa means here is talking about the king's reaction, and it's interesting here because it doesn't really talk here. It doesn't introduce. So the whole idea of the simile is from the perspective of the head elephant keeper. He's watching this and he's reacting to it. So Okay. Oh yeah. So it does say it here.
Detongne.
Detongne means so. This head elephant keeper, he saw this, right? The king was pleased, and the king sort of rewards this person, and he gets honored. And so this head elephant keeper says, "Oh, well, this is a guy who's could be my rival." And so Langboche la Wangjebe mi is a Wangjebe means the person who has authority over the elephants. And in it says there's a Sanskrit word for it, which means someone who's kind of the superintendent of the elephant, so to speak. Me, so that person, when he sees this, Yimidawa, and see, he was unhappy. This is typically the envy, right? Someone else's success, you don't like it, right? So that's Yikitunga, right? And then a second person comes along, Mikeba means, now here is Mikeba means, you don't read me as human here, you read it as a negative. Someone who is lacking in skill. Second one is ordered to try to tame an elephant. And the one who's lacking in skill failed to tame the elephant, so the king punished the person. Chebadan Jarwe, then it says, Chebadan Jar means he subjected him to a punishment. So therefore, Ludumyawa. So that's an example of physical pain that people. So this is the simile that's meant to address the main message of the verse.
Pretty obscure.
You got it? Yeah,
I got it.
I mean,
I would hate to have tried to read that Tibetan on my own and make sense of that.
You know what? I mean, Getaje only makes kind of an allusion to the story. He doesn't really tell the whole story. And you kind of have to read Chandrakirti.
Yeah, maybe.
And then, then it's easier to kind of figure it out. Okay. This is a nice verse. This is a nice verse. This is very kind of intellectual verse too. This is now section 5. Dungel, then so this is now sort of weighing. Remember, so it's weighing the kind of the influence or the intensity of the pleasures that we experience versus the pains that we experience. And one of the things which I believe it was one of the earlier verses, was that this was a theme that was introduced, which is to say that whatever we pursue as pleasures, those pleasures are somewhat evanescent and somewhat ephemeral. The suffering, on the other hand, is much more weighty. And so in that sense, so this is talking about the things that we think of as pleasurable, which from the point of view of noble truths of suffering, even pleasures are a form of suffering, namely the suffering of change. But the way they're addressed here is just to say that the things that appear pleasurable are, very transient and easily overcome. However, suffering is not. Suffering is something very weighty and sort of. Well, there was a verse about saying that, or gave the example of the person who is doing. Let's say here he is on a Saturday, enjoying the weekend. So what do you do with your, day? Is you kind of imagine, well, what can I do today that'll be really enjoyable? Well, I'll go out in my backyard in the summer, sit in my hammock and play some nice music and maybe make some food for myself. And then a mosquito comes along, and remember that verse?
Yeah.
So that was like saying that, the things that we think of as pleasurable can easily be, lost. So this verse is going to say something kind of along those lines. So it says, Dewa tope wangyur jing. So topa is a mental construct, right? A concept, so to speak. So it says, or you can say a rational thought. Then pleasure or well-being is governed by or controlled by our conceptual thoughts. And then the second part of the first half of the verse is, then our conceptual thoughts are controlled by suffering. And therefore, there is nothing, right? This is asti is there is, right? And then it comes with a negative. So there is nothing anywhere which is more powerful than suffering. Okay. So suffering controls mental thoughts, and mental thoughts govern whatever things we perceive as being pleasurable. And so if a painful thing comes along, whatever conceptual thought we had that led us to believe something was pleasurable, it wipes it out. And so by extension, whatever was thought of as being pleasurable then is destroyed in the process. Okay, so it says, so the commentary says, right? The saying, we cannot find any kind of great pleasure which has the ability to overcome or replace or overpower suffering. Right? So it'll drive away suffering and take its place. And then we can hang on to that pleasure and, be in a good place. He says there's no such thing. Why? He says, Deoani pleasures, dungelgi wandu gurbe, topa la raklete. So it says, pleasures are governed by, what does it say? Dungelgi wandu gurbe. Oh, he says are governed by, this kind of does it double. He says, pleasures are dependent upon conceptual thoughts which are governed by suffering, right? So it kind of takes the whole, the three parts of the concept, puts both of them in this kind of explanation. And he says, and he further elaborates. He says, Gita. It's just an interesting explanation, and I think something that you have to really you have to take some time to kind of appreciate. So it says, for example, and there's a kind of sense of ego, how it's in the background here. He says, mental pleasures, right? He gives an example. When a person thinks of himself or herself as a generous person, right? So I am a generous person, right? And that's a conceptual thought, right? And so you think to yourself with satisfaction, I am a generous person, and that makes you feel good. And so you have some kind of mental ease. That conceptual thought triggers or produces, right? Then that then he says, now using sticking with the same kind of idea. In Sanskrit, he gives several examples. One of them is that you're generous. What are the other ones? There are three. Let's see. 동바오 단니 추보 단니 원보유 이도원. Oh yeah. So it says one is I'm generous. One is I'm wealthy, and the third one is I have the ability to enjoy pleasant experiences. So those three kind of mental constructs give you a feeling that life is good, right? You're in a happy place. He says. On the other hand, Jorba Yekyang means though you have wealth, right? Jorba Yekyang. Junche ki dokpa, right? Juncheva means that it would be lost, come to an end, literally. Gyun cheba means the to have it continue is broken. Right? So it means that you lose that wealth. Dokbe, dokba means then the thought that you might lose that wealth, yikidewa dok, right? So that thought has the ability to overcome that mental ease. So just as a certain way of thinking, it's kind of subtle. It's saying that a lot of how we, perceive the quality of our life is the way we interpret our, circumstances. And the way we interpret our circumstances is through, mental constructs in which we evaluate our lives. If we evaluate a certain way, right, we can be pleased with ourselves. On the other hand, if we're, what do you say, we're someone who's prone to worry a lot or feel that, our circumstances are, not stable, then that kind of mental construct can destroy your, sense of ease. So yikidewa and dokpa. So mental construct, that kind of mental the opposite of a favorable mental construct, unfavorable mental construct can, destroy our sense of ease, our mental sense of ease. Dewa gyewa dangakpa. So therefore, dewa gyewa dangakpa means then the arising of a sense of ease, right? Dewa sukha means happiness, and the cessation of the sense of happiness, dope wang digursin, right, are both something that are controlled by the way in which our minds, operate, the way in which we think. So dewe dube dokpa. So dewe dube dokpa means the mental thoughts which are have here means they include dewe dube. I mean dewe dube dokpa means the kind of mental thoughts which include mental well-being, mental ease. It says then physical pain, right, or some overt kind of painful experience can destroy any kind of mental thought which is creating the idea that we are experiencing ease, right? Therefore, mental constructs are under the control of suffering. Suffering can eliminate them, right? So control them means can destroy whatever fanciful idea we have about how well off our lives may be. Deechir jikden gunna means then everywhere in the world, but in the negative. So nowhere in the world is there anything that is more powerful than painful feelings, painful sensations. Jiamedo berna chenjun yile jik rangi bushiwa le chikshokibu gurwa dunga chawa shino. So this is an interesting verse, right? So this one is saying that a lot of our sense of ease. Okay, think of it this way: the underlying idea is the notion that anything about our samsaric existence represents a form of well-being or happiness. That is a fiction, right? Especially from the point of view of Madhyamikans, right? The Madhyamikans, is pointed out. It will be pointed out, is they do not allow that there even is such a thing as a uniquely pleasant experience. that contrasts with an unpleasant experience, right? So we have supposedly three kinds of feelings, right? Pleasant, unpleasant, and those which are neutral in the sense that they're neither pleasant nor unpleasant. So this suggests that there's three fundamentally different kinds of feelings. The second skandha is made up of feelings. So in some sense, all three of those types of feelings are interpreted in the doctrine of the truth of suffering as being there's something being unsatisfactory about them, right? So we have the term suffering of change, suffering of conditioned existence. Actually, the Sanskrit word is so for the Sanskrit word for suffering is dukkha, but in the term for those three kinds of sufferings, it's not just dukkha, right, for the suffering of suffering. It's dukkha, and that ending with a T long A on the end means a state of unsatisfactoriness, a state, a condition, right, of being unsatisfactory that relates to pain, a state of being unsatisfactory that relates to ordinary pleasures, a state of being unsatisfactory that relates to neutral feelings. And so there's three kinds of suffering that are explained, right? Now, within, and all Buddhist schools, would use that terminology and interpret it in some way or another. The one which is the state of unsatisfactoriness of so-called pleasant experiences, there's a very radical disagreement in Mahayana between the Yogacharans and the Madhyamikas, especially the Prasangika, Chandakirti. And Chandakirti, it's in his description of how to understand that is in his commentary to this chapter, Chandakirti's commentary to this chapter, in which he makes direct reference to Vasubandhu, who writes in the Abhidharmakosha, in the commentary to the Abhidharmakosha, right? Vasubandhu precedes Chandakirti by whatever, a couple hundred years. And Vasubandhu, writing in the 4th century or so, reports that there were earlier schools, earlier than his time, Vasubandhu's time, which had this doctrine. This is Vasubandhu saying. This is in Inner Science that I addressed. He says, there are these Buddhists who claim there's no such thing as pleasant experiences. So in this school, in the Tibetan representation school, they say Dewarang Tsemba. Dewarang Tsemba means there's no such thing as a even conventional nature to experience that we call pleasurable, which is qualitatively different from those experiences that we call painful, right? The Madhyamikans say, and this is what Chandakirti says, that everything that we consider pleasurable is only something that's less painful than something else. And that's the only way that we can identify what we say is what we call a pleasurable experience. So that means for the Madhyamikans, for Aryadeva, if you think Aryadeva is to be understood the way Chandakirti explains him, so then Aryadeva is saying that any notion that we have about something being pleasurable is a mental construct. It's a creation of the mind. It's not something that objectively exists in any way. Whereas we can say, at the level of conventional truth, suffering, painful, unsatisfactoriness is something that we can say conventionally exists. And in fact, all experiences, properly understood, have that uniform unsatisfactoriness to it, which is a pretty radical idea. Vasubandhu says, he takes issue with that. He says, no, that there are things that are pleasurable sort of in and of themselves. So anyway, I I think this verse here lends itself particularly to this interpretation that what we consider as pleasurable is something that is created is a mental construct, right? It's not something that objectively we experience as something that qualitatively has that aspect, right? So that sort of definitely lends itself to that kind of stronger interpretation of the truth of suffering. So I'm just putting it out there. And of course, the whole point of this chapter is that the idea that there's something that is pleasurable is a so-called inverted, thought, one of the four inverted thoughts, right? So there are different shades of how to read that, right? You can say, as one who says, there are samsaric pleasures, but we are mistaken in thinking that those things that are transient pleasures are deserving of our, and giving them sort of the status of, being the purpose of life to pursue them. So in that sense, if we do that, if we allow ourselves to develop attachment for ordinary pleasures, we are perpetuating our samsara because we are reinforcing our attachment that creates, rebirth, and ultimately, or in the longer term, is, preventing us from escaping from samsara. Right? So in that sense, it's unsatisfactory in that sort of, in that sort of larger sense. That's one interpretation. Chandrakirti's interpretation is radical. He's saying, we can call it pleasure. We can call it whatever, that there's something about it that's enjoyable. He says, but actually, it's just our mind playing tricks on us. It's just that, like, typically we experience something that's unpleasant. So you give an example, hunger and thirst, right? And so to alleviate that hunger and thirst, then we eat something. And then when we do that, right, then we have the idea that as that hunger and thirst is alleviated, that experience is something that is pleasurable. But actually it isn't. Actually, it is itself. It's kind of, so there's only a continuum of unsatisfactoriness. There's no, like, two different types of experiences, pleasure and pain. So this verse kind of lends itself to that kind of model of that way of interpreting that there's no real pleasure whatsoever, that it's just a mental construct. So here he even says that. He says, so look at this is Gyetsabje. So Gyetsabje is definitely following Chandrakirti's philosophy. So he says, Jitenkuna dumele shintu toptantembe torwa dewa jiangmedo. He says, there is no such thing as a pleasurable feeling that is more powerful than suffering. And okay, so and then we have a simile. This is interesting. This is Chen Chun Yi Le Chik Rangi Bushiwa Le Chik Shikibu Gurua Dumecha Shino. This is a uses a term which is suggesting that a person has multiple wives, which I guess in India was not forbidden at all. So Chen and Chun, right? Chen and Chun is referring to an elder wife, and Chun is a younger wife. And so one of the two wives, they both had children.
The one had a child that had died. And so here it says, among the two wives, one of the two had a son that had died, Rangibushiwa. And the other one had a son that was still alive, and Kurwa means and was treated well. So the idea is that the one whose child had died was bothered by the fact that the rival wife's son was treated well, and she cried. So it doesn't tell the story here. I'll read it to you here, and then let's see. These are I don't know how big a deal they are, but anyway, let's see. So it says, let's see. 19. 춘매 뭐해요? 누에카는 쳇어도 되겠지. 야와 뭔데? 춘매 부끄러워할래. 누에 어디로만 있어? Oh yeah, 춘마 here is translated as a second wife, whose son was honored, and then the first wife was made unhappy by it. For example, so this is meant to kind of be illustrating what is mentioned as first. So how does it do that? Okay, it says. Are you following?
No, I don't see it here. Sorry, I'm lost for a second. Go on.
All right. So it says there were two wives, right? Of which one had a son that died, and the other one had a son that was still living. Right? So then, when the one whose son had died saw the other wife's child being honored, and here it says ornamented. I think that means that they were treated well. When she saw that, she it's a Shinto Muar in Tibetan seems to suggest crying. I think the Sanskrit doesn't necessarily mean shedding tears, but she was upset by it. So then the one whose child had died was asked, "Chichir mushe tibatan demeba." Oh yeah, she simbalayang chichir mus. She said. So the one whose child had died was asked, "Are you crying because of the loss of your child?" And she says, "No, I'm not crying about that." She's saying, "Rather, I'm crying about the child who is still alive." Right? 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 I'm grief-stricken about the child that still lives, which is the child of the other wife. De du chi. So I'll leave it to you to see if you can sift through this and apply it to the verse. The verse is the one who's saying, right, that mental thoughts that are pleasurable experiences are governed by mental thoughts, and mental thoughts are controlled can be subjugated by suffering, right? So therefore, there's nothing more powerful than suffering. Okay, so that's the general idea of the verse. So I guess the suffering is her grief, right? So here it says, then that woman, the one who was upset at her rival's son's good treatment, at a later time, that son became ill. Bunnawa Zhong Xian to Songo, right? And he went to another nearby village.
And then Nima Kachik Learne Jong De Dubsu Nyambata. Then the wife who had been upset by the sight of the child being treated well, she happens to come to this village, and when she's approaching it, she sees a corpse being carried. Right? Then she saw corpses being taken out of the town, and so she thought to herself, "Oh, this must be because the son that had become sick has now died." Right? They did the tumor with the Shuanyangdu. Yonsu Takso, right? So Yonsu Takso means she made that formulation in her mind. That are Yonsu Tangna, Dela Shintu Yid. Okay, so here it's saying that was her mental construct, right? And that mental construct, the thought of the other child's death, pleased her. So she's not crying anymore. Now she's feeling happy, right? Yidewa Gela. So that is saying that happiness is something that is governed by mental thoughts, right? Dewa Gela Dikpe Yana Gichala Dumbanta.
Can we guess the child didn't die, right?
I don't think that matters. Yana Gichala. I'm not reading that Tibetan. Let's read this translation again. After a few days had passed, she returned to her own village and saw a corpse being carried away from her. She imagined that it was the other wife's dead son. She used her imagination in this way and became very happy. Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. If you didn't know this, you wouldn't get how the simile works with it. It said dikpa, right? Did you ever find this?
I got it, yeah.
Okay, so it says dikpa there. Dikpa usually means, evil. But actually, it's also dikparanya means scorpion, and that's what it means here. Okay.
Oh.
So what happens is she gets bitten on the leg by a scorpion. Okay, so now that's the pain that she experiences, right? And that destroys her happiness, right? That's how it's been taken. Let's see, where are we here? Oh yeah. So she's, first of all, she thinks that the child's dead, so that makes her happy. And then dikpe yanagi chala dumba. Okay, now I remember. Okay, so a scorpion, yanagi cha, means part of one of her limbs gets stung by a scorpion. Decher dela tokbe wangi yidawa tiaba dugi dungel sigiment. So the pain caused by the bite of the scorpion got rid of whatever happiness she had created by her, imagination. So therefore, this illustrates how there's nothing stronger than pain. Right? Pain is stronger than whatever temporary thought you may have that causes you to feel happy. Chinchi look. Oh, here. See. So here he does. This is Chandakirti. Dita. Ganchir chinchi logle kieba. Oh, he writes a verse. Okay. Sometimes Chandakirti writes his own verses, right?
I think many times.
Yeah, a number of times. Yeah. So here he writes a verse, and in this verse he makes reference to the verse, but he puts some of his own language in it. So he says, Didar. Ganchir means because Chinlok lekim. Actually, I have it in Sanskrit, so why do I don't need to look at that. Let's see. Viparya satyato jatam. Okay, viparya satyato jatam. Because it arose from that inverted way of thinking, right? Inverted way of thinking means thinking that there is such a thing as happiness in samsara, right? So because that thing which made her happy arose, was produced by mistaken thinking in the first place. Sukham tasmat sudurlabham. He says, therefore, happiness, the things which we consider to be happiness, therefore, are very difficult to encounter. Right? It's saying, this is that's a very Buddhist idea. It's saying the reality is all of our life is pervaded by suffering, right? So the notion of something being satisfactory or a form of happiness or a form of well-being, that is all created by the mind. And it's not something that's actually there. And therefore, it's sudurlabham means very hard to encounter that, right? Dukkam tu Buddha niryata. Suffering, on the other hand, is produced correctly. The idea of suffering or the experience of suffering, it actually accords with samsaric existence. Okay? Therefore, tad balavattaram. So therefore, suffering is the more powerful experience, much more powerful than the notion of something being pleasurable. You get the idea? Yeah.
I just want, because I'm so confused by this.
Yeah.
Are they referring to the idea that it is a mistake, obviously, to look for enjoying permanent types of happiness and well-being? But what about just, transient, granted it's evanescent, but it's still pleasing and pleasant?
Yeah.
Is that okay to see it that way?
Well, I think this is, I think the idea, how should I respond to that? I mean, I'm giving my personal opinion, right? Okay. So I don't think, okay, this is from my own experience. Okay? From my own experience, typically, I'll give you an example. So I remember when I first came to New Jersey, I was 22 or so, and I knew nothing about Dharma. I just had this extraordinary opportunity to live with, some Tibetan dishes, and someone actually became my teacher for many years. And so one of the things that struck me was we're living very simply, and the food and everything was pretty basic, and what kind of, this is something that sort of over time I developed this kind of, it wasn't something that I was any insight on my part, but it's just something that sort of I came to sort of develop this idea, which was reinforced by teachers, was that if you live a life according to the Dharma, then that kind of life, by its very simplicity and by the fact that you are not creating your own turmoil, right? A lot of things that we encounter in life that are, become problems, not everything, but a lot of them are of our own making, right? And that if we have, but however you want to describe it, but if you sort of eliminate that aspect from your life and you don't sort of create more misery for yourself than there already is, that's a very peaceful way to be. And so kind of that
it is sort of given as a model for how to live one's life. So the more that you live your life in tune with the Dharma, the more the less grief you will put yourself through, and by doing that, you are very much more at ease than you might otherwise be. So I don't know if that's not the way exactly you raised the question, but that's kind of an aesthetic which I was sort of brought to think of, and something which I very much value. And I often tell my wife that that if we know how to live properly, we can avoid a lot of unnecessary trouble, and that's the most that we can really expect from a samsaric life, and that there's nothing wrong with that. It's a kind of quiet, peaceful existence that allows you, then gives you hopefully you have freedom or the opportunity to then cultivate something which is more otherworldly, or something that is related to an ultimate purpose. And so the idea of giving much attention to the here and now in terms of deriving some kind of satisfaction from it, that's kind of, I think, it's not going to provide much. I mean, to say, well, does that mean you shouldn't eat food that tastes good, or you shouldn't allow yourself to have some kind of basic comfort in life? No, I don't think it's just that at all. But the idea that we should somehow sift through the possible things that we can engage in terms of everyday activities, and sort of single out some as a good thing to pursue versus the other ones that are sort of not really worthwhile. That's kind of I'm not here to judge, I'm not here to say, but I think that's really not very important to make those kinds of distinctions, like to say, well, this category of thing is really a waste of time, this category of thing is okay, this category of thing is really worth taking time to cultivate. I think from the point of view of Dharma, they all sort of fall into the same category. That's not to say that, it said in the very first verses, that no matter the fact that our lives are pervaded by suffering, nevertheless, we need to preserve life as much as possible and make the most of it spiritually. So, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm too hardcore about it, but that's kind of the way I think. I mean, having said that, do I waste time watching television? Yes, I do. I certainly, I will admit that. And I don't. But I also would say I'm wasting my time. So I readily acknowledge that. I mean,
but isn't it true that when you do meditation,
Mhm.
You have to you cannot be too much in pain or too happy, because otherwise you cannot get that. So there is certain happiness that has to exist in order to do your meditation. Because if you meditate, you're too depressed, for example, or too excited, you cannot manage to do the depression. How do you? That's not completely suffering, right? It's a little bit of happiness in there in order to be able to do meditation, right?
Okay. I mean, maybe you're reacting to the idea that that this is sort of almost like unhealthy to be constantly telling yourself everything about life is suffering, and that if you're always thinking that that might lead to some kind of depression, or some kind of God knows what, that you might whatever. take extreme measures because life is so horrible. I don't think that, that's not, that's not the point. The point is not to tell yourself that everything is painful. That's why I like to translate the word dukkha as unsatisfactory. I think, and so the distinction that I would make is that kind of the antithesis of this is to feel complacent, to feel that there is something about life that's okay and you don't have to be overly concerned about it. I think that kind of the full-on Buddhist position. Okay, I'll say this, and I think this is a point which is not really often. This is a distinction which I don't think is often appreciated. That in Buddhism, if you especially read, well, if you're in the Lamrim, for instance, or particularly even in something in a text like the Ratnagottara, the classic text for Buddha nature, they classify persons basically 4 types. One type of person is the person who is uninterested in the Dharma and whom would not, it's unpersuadable. And so that person basically is to be left alone and not, you don't just needlessly try to deal with that person. You just say, okay. Then there's the person who is, quote, the householder. And typically the householder, as a Buddhist, is a person who is primarily focused on pursuit of the word svarga. Svarga means literally means some kind of celestial realm in a future life. So create virtue in order to have a happy future existence. That person is not likely to have the opportunity to learn deeply about the Four Noble Truths. And that person would not, there would be no real need even to address, say, the doctrine of selflessness to that person. That person, basically, you teach them about karma, and that's it. So that person is driven by an idea of a happy existence beyond this one. So you're not saying to that person, hey, wait a minute, it's still samsara. That's really not a worthwhile goal. You don't go there with that person because they're not a candidate for saying something more, something deeper. And then there is, quote, the person who is, has the potential to seek their own nirvana. Okay, so you don't tell them, you don't urge them to try to develop bodhicitta. You teach them how to free themselves from samsara. So that person definitely would be a candidate for saying all of samsara is suffering, all of samsara is a burning house. Try to get out of it, and always be, have the sense of alarm about not trying to free yourself from samsara. So that person, you're presenting them with something that makes them, quote, turn away completely from samsara and be, one-pointedly focused on liberation. And so nothing else about samsara really matters. Now, having said that, it doesn't mean, to, like you say, it's the middle way. You don't, needlessly torment yourself. But you don't think of anything in samsara as being worthwhile. I think that's a pretty fair, and you see that between those two individuals, for one,
you wouldn't really necessarily be emphasizing that point. For the other, you would, right? And then for the Mahayanas, and that's exactly why we're reading this. This is a point that I try to make, is that unless you have a radical sense of samsara as being totally undesirable, it's not possible to develop genuine bodhicitta. That's kind of what I would maintain. And so that's really, I said at the beginning of this, when we started reading this, is that's the reason why we're reading this. Because I want to be a Mahayanist, but I want to be a Mahayanist who has the foundation, right? The same foundation of the Four Noble Truths, which gives that person the knowledge that will allow you to develop genuine bodhicitta, because just as you see your own samsaric existence is completely top to bottom unsatisfactory, then you turn it to the other person. You say, well, that's what they're experiencing, and then be moved by that to be concerned for them. So unless you have it to that degree for yourself, you're not going to, how could you possibly have it for somebody else, right? So that's that point. The other point is that the Four Noble Truths, properly understood, will enable you to develop correct understanding of selflessness, the selflessness of the person. Now, granted that the explanation of the selflessness of the person, has different levels of interpretation among the different schools, but I think that also is, in fact, Chandrakirti makes the point. He makes the point that the kind of conventional interpretation of the Four Noble Truths, which includes this idea of the selflessness of the person, is such that the selflessness of the person is the understanding that we are completely and totally defined by our five skandhas and nothing more. There's no self apart from them or within them, right? And Chandrakirti acknowledges that that's the conventional view of the selflessness of the person. And he also says that it's limited. It's not radical enough. It's not far-reaching enough. That the true understanding of selflessness of the person requires you to understand emptiness. So that's a second reason to have that conventional understanding of the selflessness of the person sort of to some degree understood, then that becomes a platform upon which you can interpret or explain Chandrakirti's more radical doctrine of the selflessness of the person. So those are the kind of, both for the sake of bodhicitta and for the sake of wisdom, this subject matter for a Mahayanist is equally essential, even though it's not, sufficient or it's not the end, but it is necessary. So I would say, in fact, there is a line, and I'm just sort of to finish the point. There is a line in which in Asanga's Bodhisattva Bhumi, in the chapter on morality, where he makes the point, he defines one of the transgressions, Bodhisattva transgressions. In Tibetan, it's called Korachipu Drogarsen, which means, Koro means in samsara. Chipur means, question of why. Chipur usually means alone, but I think what it means is to have the mistaken idea that because you are seeking enlightenment, therefore it is unnecessary for you to be overly concerned about controlling the mental afflictions, because you have to remain in samsara for the sake to act on behalf of sentient beings. So Asanga says, if you use that justification as the reason for not trying to keep your mental affliction sort of under control. That itself is a transgression. He says and there's a line, I can find it. It's a very nice line, and Tsongkhapa quotes it. Let's see if I can find it. Oh yeah. I said this. I gave this a heading. These are on my own headings. These are not in the text. I call this regarding samsara with complacence. Right. This is a word that I was using before. Feeling that samsara is okay to be in samsaras. Any bodhisattva who holds the following view or professes it to others commits an offense and a transgression, and he or she acquires an afflicted offense. A bodhisattva should not abide. This is the belief, the mistaken belief. A bodhisattva should not abide with an attitude that delights in nirvana. Nirvana, he or she is not primarily concerned about nirvana because it's concerned about Buddha. Right? Should not abide with an attitude that delights in nirvana. You say, well, I'm a bodhisattva, so I shouldn't be seeking hinana nirvana. Rather, he or she should abide with an attitude that is turned away from nirvana. I'm not seeking nirvana. I push away nirvana because I'm seeking. He or she should not fear the root or secondary mental afflictions. He or she should not be striving exclusively to separate his or her mind from them, from mental afflictions. For enlightenment must be pursued by bodhisattva while remaining in samsara for 3 immeasurable spans of time. So don't worry about the mental afflictions. Just do your best to help others, right? Then it says, if you think like that, he says, that you commit an offense. It says, why? And now this is a Sangha sort of clarification. A bodhisattva should engender delight towards nirvana and aversion for the root and secondary mental afflictions that is 1 trillion times greater than the delight that a listener, cultivates toward nirvana, and the aversion that he or she, the Hinayana person, develops towards the root and mental afflictions. You should be that much more, disciplined. This is because a listener is dedicated to the pursuit of his or her own welfare, but a bodhisattva is dedicated to the welfare of all sentient beings. Thus, a bodhisattva must attain a state of self-discipline in which his or her mind remains so free of the mental afflictions that even though not an arhat, right? Even though not an arhat, he or she can interact with entities that have the potential to cause the outflows, that's the word for mental affliction, to arise in such a manner that the unafflicted state of mind, so the ability to remain unperturbed by everyday life, which he or she possesses, is even superior to that of an arhat. So that's, I think that, that pertains to the point that you can't say I'm a bodhisattva, so I don't have to be, wholly concerned about seeking enlightenment. You have to, you are supposed to be in samsara, but not of samsara. But the only way to do that is if you have a certain, mental discipline and insight even that allows you to do that. Without it, forget it. You'll be, kidding yourself. I don't know if that answers or.
No, that's really helpful. But I am still stunned by that statement of Chandakirti's, which you said that. It's just a continuum of dissatisfactoriness. I still have to wrap my head around.
Yeah.
I really thought that you could say some things are pleasurable.
I know they quote seem pleasurable.
Yeah.
But they are. It is not because they are what we call pleasurable. Is somehow qualitatively has some element to it
that differentiates it from the things that we identify as unpleasant or unsatisfactory.
Right.
He says, that's not so.
Yeah, and I wasn't seeing it like that.
Yeah.
I really thought there were pleasant feelings, neutral and unpleasant,
Yeah.
and now it's just all unpleasant.
Well, that is disposition, which,
Yeah.
which I hope to get to. It's an interpretation of the suffering of change, which is different from the more conventional interpretation of suffering of change, and it's somewhat mentioned in the Lama Chamo, but it's not really emphasized. So anyway, I try to explain it in the other book on inner science. Give explanations of it, but the discussion comes at the end of this chapter. So I invite you to come back and hear what that is. How are we doing time-wise? Okay, let's see. Okay, so try another verse.
Mm.
Okay, so now let's see. This is now verse 9. Okay? No, verse 10. All right. Okay, so Dewaliki Drombo Dabursama. This is an interesting. This verse has a term in it. Again, the differentiating between what is self and other. It makes a difference between swa. Swa means one's own, and para, which means something that is the other. Right? Just like the distinction of self and other, right? That we know in a broader sense. Here, it uses that otherness, that idea of otherness, in relation to so-called pleasures or so-called and pleasant experiences. There's an otherness to them, and so let me not get ahead of myself. So here, Getade translate this word para, right? Para, it can mean other. It can also mean a stranger. It can also mean a foreigner. It can mean in some contexts, it can mean someone that's hostile. So here it uses the phrase like an other, para what. In Tibetan it says Shembotabur, right? Now, more strictly, typically, para would be just translated shen, rang and shen, right? But Gesabje here uses Shembo. Here he is talking about he actually glosses it in the heading as drombo. So drombo here, I think, is being is taking the word para in the sense of a foreigner or someone who is alien, like that. So it says Sorwa Dewa Luki Drombo Tabursama. So it's just, or you could say visitor, right? Something that only temporarily is experienced. Right? For the most part, we are subject to suffering, but every once in a while there is a short-term quote visit from something that we call pleasurable. Then so he says, so this point that's being made here is that pleasurable feelings are in some sense alien, I guess, alien to our nature. He says, okay, so he says, okay, so now, well, let's go to Chandrakirti's introduction to this verse and see how he sets it up for this. So the key word in this verse here is the notion of being
quote, like an other, right? Something that is other to us. There's an entry in the Money Williams dictionary which says that phrase, like an other, means like a stranger. Means like, so in that case, like someone that is separate from us in some sense. Okay, so let's see what we have here. Okay, so he says, so it says, before he said previously about the pleasures are, difficult to obtain, evanescent, and suffering is much more powerful and kind of blows in whatever semblance of pleasure that we might experience for the moment can just completely eradicate it by its presence. He says, so it says, even though pleasure is difficult to obtain, we don't experience it that often, right? It's rare. Nevertheless, pleasure is something that does not do us any harm. And here the key notion is that pleasure is something that's salutary, right? It's something that, if experienced, the definition of the way the three kinds of feelings are typically explained in the Abhidharma is, how do you define pleasure? Pleasure is that thing which, when you experience it, you want it to continue. You don't want it to end. How do you define pain? How do you define suffering? Suffering is that thing which, when you experience it, you want it to no longer not continue. You want to get rid of it. And so it's that unwanted quality versus that thing which, when experienced, is gratifies us, and we want it to continue endlessly if possible. So he says, because the nature of what we call pleasant feelings is such that it does not do us any harm, it does not cause us any pain or discomfort, therefore we can say that it's something that and now it uses this word. It is an interesting phrase. So there's a word is swabhava, right? Swabhava is something's essential nature. And then when we talk about the self, right, or when we talk about the belief in the self, right, in Tibetan, Jigdzogla Tao, right, the technical Abhidharma term for mistaken belief in itself is called satkaya drishti, right? The belief in the perishable assemblage, right? So that belief is said to have two aspects to it. Dak dudzimba, right? So there's a notion of a self that you perceive and which you adhere to. And then it also has an aspect which is atmiya. Atmiya means the possessive form of it, which is mine, right? So it's the notion of the five skandhas, our body and our minds. They are not, quote, the self, but they are part of the self. They belong to the self. It's my body. It's my pain. It's my pleasure. Or even inanimate things. This is my book, and so on. So both of those are kind of the two modes of belief in a real self. Now here, there's another sense of that word mind, right? Atmiya. Atmiya means of the self, right? Belonging to the self. So belonging to the self can also mean belonging to the nature, right? Belonging to the nature of something. So he uses that word here. Chandrakirti uses that word here to say of pleasure. That we can identify pleasure as something that we want to be part of our being, part of our
nature, right? Even though it's not, even though it's rare, right?
Mhm.
Nevertheless, it's also something that once it is encountered in whatever way, we want to. He uses that word deliberately. I mean, we want to own it. We want to keep it. We want it to be a part of us.
Mhm.
And so, therefore, the idea is here is saying, therefore, it's not wrong, right, to seek those kinds of experiences, right? So then he's saying, then he says, so that means that something that you want to be part of you, right, is pleasure. There's nothing wrong with wanting it, right? Because it's salutary. It is, it doesn't do you harm. On the other hand, dungelni, even though suffering. Now this is his introduction to the verse. He says, by contrast, suffering is something which, even though it's abundant, right? Even though we have lots of it, he says, it's harmful to us. It is inimical to our well-being, and therefore we should treat it as something other. That's how he sets up using the word other here. It's not something that we want to identify with as part of our being, right? So using that, we're going to separate ourselves from it. We want it to be part of us. So here in the verse, Aryadeva is going to say, no, that's not the case. It is pleasure, or it is pleasant experiences have an otherness to them, and that otherness indicates both their lack of frequency, and also the fact that they're not part of our identity. We should not think of them as part of our identity. And so here, that's kind of the logic of the way the verse is set up. So here it says, jita jita dudrawa, means however much time goes by, right? Jita jita dudrawa. Deta deta dungel pel, right? It says, to the same degree, our suffering increases. And this is a really, I mean, as I'm reading it right now, I mean, I can see kind of a message to it, which has a lot of kind of resonance to it. So Jita Jita Dudronga is talking about the passage of life, the passage of your own life, right? As you get older, right, you become more vulnerable to suffering, you become more vulnerable to sickness, right? And ultimately, then you face your demise. So it's saying the nature of our life is, however long our life goes, suffering gets worse, not better, right? And part of the message to that is the idea, it has built into it the idea of our desire to live as long as possible, right? Nobody has the idea, the idea in the first chapter, in fact, is the idea of, of permanence, mistakenly thinking of permanence rather than impermanence. So the sosokyo is the non-arya. The non-arya is the quintessential, uninformed and misguided and confused person. And that person, how do they view their life? They want to live long. However, the longer they live, the more they're going to be exposed to suffering, right? So that's kind of the first part of the verse. Is kind of addressing that, and there is that message in it as well. And so the idea of kind of being attached to this world and this life and wanting it to
go on as long as possible, is again sort of from a Dharma point of view, it's kind of misguided, right? You're fooling yourself into thinking that there's anything about this ordinary samsaric life that is deserving of you wanting to live longer rather than, free yourself from its essential quality. He says, therefore, he says, in this body, right? Kadevara. In that kadevara, I don't know if that's if it has the same resonance to it in Sanskrit or not. But what's interesting is there's many words for body. This word is kadevara. Does that remind you of anything? Kadevara. How about the word cadaver?
Oh, cadaver.
It's
Yeah.
cadaver, right?
Yeah.
So just like in this carcass.
Jeez.
Therefore, in this body, in this kadevara, pleasure is perceived to be an other, right? It's something that is not part and parcel of our being. Part and parcel of our being is that however long our life goes, our suffering tends towards suffering. It doesn't tend towards pleasure. It doesn't tend towards, happiness, right? Therefore, the idea of happiness is something basically that's alien to our being. So, and what is coming from that, or what's included in that, is the idea that our fixation with, seeking happiness in samsara is misguided, right? That's really kind of the underlying message for the entire chapter. So that's a pretty strong verse. So the more the time passes, the more suffering increases. Therefore, the pleasure of this body appears to be as if it were a stranger, as if it were something foreign to our being. So, I think that verse kind of speaks for itself. If you kind of let it do so. Anyway, we go. Okay, so Torah Dewa. Okay, this is okay. Torah Dewa Luke Ranshin Mimbartel. Okay, this is a debate language, right? And Torah Dewa means pleasant feelings. Luki Rangshin Mimbartel means is making this assertion, this argument, right? Saying pleasant feelings are not part of the nature of the body, are alien to the body, or foreign to the body, right? Why? This has to end somewhere with a chip, right? It comes at the end. He says, why? Then he says, a child. Jiva means, a young child. This is talking about stages of life. From the stage of a child, then the next one is youth, right? Youth. Kumar means like a young person, like a teenager. Dharla Bhava means then like a young adult, but someone still vigorous. Deva means then old age. So these are as time goes by, right? Through those stages of life. Jita Dudrawa means that's how you should understand the meaning as time goes by. Deta Geva so Dungel Pella, right? Then the only thing that increases is our suffering, and this is kind of the language that this is kind of in prose how Chandrakirti describes this. He says, "Pleasure. What do pleasures do? We leave pleasures farther and farther behind. Right? They are become more and more distant. Right? This is Gabnecheva means behind. They are. We leave our ability to experience, comfort and ease and so on, farther and farther behind as time goes by. Therefore, Dewa Ludi Shembo. Ludi Shembo means therefore pleasure is not something that is part of the nature of the body. it is something foreign, something that is separate from the body. This idea of otherness is something that is not part of our nature, so to speak, right? Sharetam Jumbo. It's like someone who only stays for a day or two. Right? It's like a visitor who comes for a day or two. Sharetam Jumbo Tabur. Right? So it's something temporary. It's not something that is built in. Perna lounge majority of kibu in reshin ngawa danam gap sebe to ne pewashino. Then it is similarly, I'm not going to dwell on it, but it just says it's like when you go on a long journey, kibu means person who goes on a long journey. As the voyage, as the trip gets longer and longer, you become more tired, right? Just from the effort of traveling. And your provisions are used up. Therefore, it becomes the longer you travel, the more difficult it becomes. So, what I like about this verse is there really is the message in there that the so-called ordinary person who is attached to this life is really asking to prolong his or her suffering. Because by its very nature, the older you get, the more suffering you're going to have to endure. And I think I don't think I'm reading that into it. I think that's definitely part of kind of the, what do you call it, the resonance. It's in the verse. I think to me, that's very beautiful. Yeah. So I'm always reminded the Buddha attained enlightenment at the age of 39. I think, right? That's pretty young. Yeah. So it's like at the tail end of your life, it becomes harder and harder to, achieve more things. Okay. Anyway. Okay, let's do one more, and then I'm kind of running out of energy myself. So this is the last one. This is in this whole series. This is Dumba, means this whole series of verses that are meant to reflect on suffering as the main focus of what's being taught in a variety of different ways. I would say this is verse 11, and this started with verse 3, so that would have been 9 verses, right? These 9 verses. And then it kind of, after that, it shifts. And after this verse, after verse 11, we shift into that topic of Deoran Zemba Me. Means there's no such thing as suffering. I'm sorry, there's no such thing as a distinct form of experience that we can identify as uniquely pleasurable, as opposed to, by contrast with what we consider to be suffering. And so that will be dealing with the suffering of change. Okay, but before that, this final verse says, and this is a kind of an easy one. It says, that says the causes of suffering. This is a verse that's the causes of pleasure. This is kind of the two halves of the verse. Those things which appear. Those things which appear means those things which are become evident in our lives, in that sense of appear, right? In the sense of what we encounter, right? So, but it's the verse to be evident, to be seen in the sense of to be encountered or come across. So it says illnesses, right? Illnesses. There are, how many illnesses? And then it says, as well as other things, right? Other things mean there are other causes of pain, other causes of more, direct kinds of, car accident or whatever, an enemy getting mugged on the street or whatever. That would be another cause of suffering, right? However many, yavanto means whatever is the extent of the causes of suffering, be they illnesses or other things that we observe, tavanto means to the same extent we do not see the causes of happiness to be equal in numbers, the idea, right? So the number of causes for untoward experiences is much greater than the number of causes towards our what we consider to be pleasure and happiness and well-being. Okay, so I translated this. However, many of the illnesses and other causes of suffering that are seen, the causes of humans' pleasure/happiness are not seen to be as many. Probably something like that. Verse 11. Huh? The causes of people's pleasure are not experienced to the same extent. Experienced, but the seen is literally what it says, as illnesses and other causes of pain. Okay, so all right, so here he's saying, so this is, comparing suffering to pleasure on the basis of the conditions that bring them about. And so the conditions that are responsible for unpleasant experiences are much greater than the conditions that bring us short-lived and very temporary kinds of happiness. What is it? The message is, therefore, recognize samsara as, pervaded by suffering, and as, pleasures as being so rare that we ought not to be overly concerned about trying to obtain them. I mean, that seems to be what the verses suggest. Okay. So it starts out, there are many causes for suffering. The inner causes are illnesses and the like. That's biological inside our bodies. And the other causes of suffering means those that are due to external conditions. They also are many. And to that extent, humans are not seen to have the same amount of causes and conditions to bring about their happiness. Immaterial, he says. Then, okay, so this is sort of the conclusion to reach based on that statement. Dungel jumar jungwe kyor chagoso. Okay, so this is very typical, very Buddhist kind of statement, right? Just, therefore, because suffering occurs continuously, right? Dungel jumar jungwe. The way is mean because of that. Kyor chagoso. One should develop a sense of alarm / concern / apprehension about the suffering nature of our lives, and make the determination to decide what to do about it. Right? Okay, then here is this simile is Swayamvara, right? Swayamvara is to the queen to choose. Is that how it's done? Okay. So he's saying, so there are many suitors, right, who would like to be chosen, right, and so they make they do whatever they can to make themselves appear desirable, but only one of them will be chosen. So the greater number of them will experience, dissatisfaction, as opposed to
one individual who's chosen. So that's kind of so it says many suitors, most of the suitors will have their desires frustrated, and they will meet with some dissatisfaction or failure, as opposed to the one individual who's chosen. Okay, so maybe we'll stop there. I don't want to appear as though I'm preaching or trying to convince you of anything. I'm gone. I'm beyond convincing. So I like to refer to myself as hardcore. But I don't expect everyone else to be
Hardcore.
that far gone. So, but I try to I think faithfully try as much as I can faithfully to render what I think these listeners are saying. And I have to say that for me, a part of the challenge of the verses is that if you just read them at first blush, they seem very simplistic, and it doesn't necessarily seem very persuasive. So to me, the challenge of what I'm doing my best to try to do is to try to sort of unpack the verses in a way where they carry a message that has some sort of force to it that is true to the Buddhist tradition. So that's it. Anybody wants to offer their own thoughts, by all means.
I just want to ask a question. So in the way that at least this has it, the way that verse 10 ends?
10. Okay.
No, 11, I'm sorry.
Okay.
It says per shintu yi dewale. I'm not sure I understand.
Are you talking about the commentary?
No, the actual root verse. 11. The way that
Dungegini gumango nenam dangi shenam guba. Deni duni minona dewa gyudana. You're
verse 11. It's the way that it's that last line of verse 11.
read it in Tibetan
Uh,
or English for that matter.
Dewi Gyudak
tell Shimbale
Nangmayin.
Shimbayi Dewale. Tell Shimbayi Dewale. So it begins Dugyo Hini Gyurmambo Nenam Dan Shenan Gyurba.
Sorry? Shen what?
Shenan Gyurba.
I'm not sure what you're reading from. Oh, Shen Angura.
Yeah.
Shen. Oh, okay.
So,
All right, I got it.
But it ends on the word le.
It does?
Well, in this one it does. Yeah. In this document.
Oh,
Really?
there are different editions of the Tibetan.
Oh, you're reading something else. What are you reading
I'm reading the root text of.
Okay.
there?
Dunga gini gumango nenam dani shenan gurba. Deni duni minam la peshin bayi. Peshin bayi.
It seems to be a comparative, but I don't see that.
I don't know. That's
Is it just a misprint or is it?
Dunga gini gumango. Dunga gini gumango. This is the first line. Anyway. Nenam dan shenan gurba. No, that's the same.
That's right. Yeah. It's the last
Dini
one.
Duni
Oh yeah, no, you're
Inam La.
no.
Oh, he's got a different
No,
last line.
you know what? You don't have the second half of the verse because
No, he does. He has.
Peshin Bayi Dewale is the next verse.
Oh.
So you somehow the second half
It's
of
a
that
corrupted
verse.
text. I
Yeah.
mean, this is a corrupted
Yeah,
font.
Peshin Bayi Dewale is the next verse.
Okay, because I have Andy just sent me the Chantakirtis, so it must be in Chantakirtis.
Yeah, Chandrakirti is correct. It's different than this file.
Well, but I mean, it's missing the second half of the verse.
Yeah, apparently.
About the second half of
In
verse 11.
the root text.
He's missing the last line.
Last two lines.
No, I think just the last one.
I think just the last line because
Yeah, I think the three previous were.
Oh, okay.
yeah,
All right.
that's funny.
I'm not sure. I mean, some of the, there is the Tengyur. In the Tengyur, there is the root text as a separate work. Then there's this commentary by Chandkirti, which I believe is the only commentary in the Tengyur on this text. And then there are different editions of the Tengyur, and there are slight variations among the editions. But no, that what you have is somehow was.
Yeah, I just thought
missing
maybe
it.
I wasn't
No,
understanding.
you're missing along. Anything else? Uh-huh. Okay. So, all right. I'll give you a tease for the last verse. I think it's the last verse. It's really beautiful. Let's see if I can find it here. I think it's the last verse. No, it's the second to last verse. Second to last verse is verse 24. It says, instead of saying, I'll paraphrase. I'm not necessarily. Yeah, I did translate. So it says something that is to be taught to the ordinary person. Sosokyo, right? Sosokyo is this, not the quote non-Arya, right? So non-Arya by definition is someone who's confused, someone who's still subject to all the mental afflictions. So what the non-Arya needs to be taught is, and then this is the doctrine, or this is the instruction. You, right? Meaning you, ordinary person, you are not so free of attachment, right? This is a big Buddha, not Buddhist. The Indian word is detachment, right? Vairagya means to free yourself from passion. That's kind of that term is common. Not only it's common to Buddhists and non-Buddhists alike, and it's kind of the ideal is to become detached from one's imperfect existence. So here it just says what the ordinary person needs to be taught is you are not free of attachment to suffering, right? So what that is saying, what that implies is you are attached, but what you don't realize you are being attached to is you are being attached to something that is by its very nature suffering. So that is kind of the height of ignorance, is to be attached to something that is undesirable, right? So he says, therefore, the Tathagatas, he says, the Tathagatas declared this to be the worst of all forms of ignorance. Is not to realize that we are not free of attachment to suffering, to what is undesirable, to what is unsatisfactory. And that's kind of the essence of being trapped in samsara is to have attachment for what is unworthy of attachment, but we, in our confusion, nonetheless have attachment. I thought that's a beautiful verse.
It is.
So I'll leave you with that. Okay. So then we recite the Lamrim prayer. What happened to Bob?
She went to her car to get her folder, maybe.
Oh,
There she is. Oh, there she is.
you disappeared. Teni rindu bele konini Anayamba ganshi sabate lo mi mari ki tong ro wa nam ren gya we wan bo da gyu chi ter ma sun be ze ra kun du yang cham be yang gi ze we je sun me tem be rim ba gun san lam gi cho nye ne dru be ge nan nye je jo rangi ji shin to be lang yi ne shu ra ze we jang be ta ke gi dro we yi ki mun ba se je ne ge we den ba yu rin zing yu shi den ba rin jin cho gi ma gya ma ya gyan nyam ba gyu pe cho te nin je chen bu yi ra gyu ba yi pen de se wa je ba ju se je gya we me jung jin le ju chan ju lang gi ren be gyam Tandu nam gi yi la pe te jin ge we ze ba rin du kyung gyur ji lam san dru be tu gen dru che jin ge gen ze je mi dan mi min gun ze ra kun du ge we na pa yi Nam na lam dan dra war ma gyu chi gan ze te pa cho la chu 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 su jin dru la zun ba de yi ze du den nam gi tak tu tro che jin tra ji gya tsu cho kun kya gyu ji Ke wo kun sonan ye she zo zo shin sonan ye she le jong we tam ba kun yi do ba re jo.
Okay. Class in 2 more weeks. Again, May 18th.
Okay.
Just verifying.
Yes, that was what we said, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.